Welcome to the Barbell Strategy Podcast,
where we talk about coaching,
training,
and all things strength and conditioning
to help the fitness athlete,
CrossFitter, and the coach. Please share and enjoy.
So Sam, I went to the physio for my dog Charlie yesterday, and he's been having some issues with his walking. If he walks for longer than, let's say, 2 hours, he starts to limp and stuff. And anyway, I've been instructed to do physio work on him at home. So a little bit of effleurage, a little bit of massage, and then getting some mobilization of the joints. And it's funny because the recommendations they gave me were like, okay, turn his two 1 hour walks into 4 30-minute walks. Every day do a little bit of movement through every single joint. Make sure he doesn't sit with his paws just like splaying out to the side and him just going like complete knee valgus.
Yeah.
Anyway, she's explaining all this stuff to me and I was thinking to myself, I was like, yeah, all right, okay, cool. A little bit of movement every day, a little bit of load management, all of these things. So
all like fundamental principles of like physiotherapy, just apply to a dog. Like at the end of the day, it's not that different. Did they give you a TheraBand and do some exercises with him with that as well?
No, thankfully not. But she did start speaking about fascia, and I was thinking to myself, oh, here we go.
Oh, yeah. Well, as long as it's not his glutes that are the issue and he needs to do glute activation drills, then you're sweet.
Yeah, she did say we need to get like neurology test on him because there is something I think was going on there. But she was trying to explain, the central nervous system and that's the thing that's in charge and everything. And I was like, don't worry, you don't have to explain that to me. I know all this stuff. But
you got it.
Yeah.
Maybe my next degree then I'll do animal physio instead of human physio.
It was interesting because the physio veterinary clinic here, like they had a few different things, and one of the things was like it's like a water tank, and I saw a dog in the water tank getting like treats on the other side. I was just like, okay, and then there was these two vets either side analysing the walk and everything, and I was like, yeah, this would be quite a cool, interesting job.
What do you think people would pay more for, physio for themselves or physio for their dog?
Physio for a dog.
100%.
Yeah, I would pay a lot more, and I think, everything like food, the amount it costs per. If I weigh up all the food that I eat versus what Charlie eats, the price per kilogram or whatever for him is a lot higher than it is for us. Just basic stuff like I'm always looking at what a new lead we can get him or something like that and whatever. I paid a lot for him to do some dog training as well, and I was like, I don't spend money on myself like this.
Yeah, it's crazy, hey? I know people who feed their dogs better than they feed themselves.
Mm-hmm.
It's crazy. I get it because obviously it's your dog, you love it, but still.
And then what do people do as well? Like, there's, I remember once we got told, he needs to lose a little bit of weight. So what do? We just cut his food down gradually, a little bit by little bit. He lost a few kilos, and he's probably gone a little bit too far in terms of weight loss. So we're adding a little bit more, and you tell someone to do that with their own nutrition, and it's like...
there's 1,000 reasons why they can't, hey?
Yeah. So today we are going to be talking about some of the biggest things that we start working on with new clients. So sort of continuing that, these discussions around the first part of working with people. And we went away and came up with the 3 biggest things that we work on, or the 3 biggest patterns that we see in new clients that we start working with. For me, mine are probably a little bit more based on training process, and I think Sam has definitely got a few which are a little bit more specific. So we're just going to jump straight into it. So we've got 6 points collectively. So Sam, let's start us off with your number 1.
I think one of the big things for me is people, I don't know if it's because of the demographic that I tend to work with, or the length of time people are doing CrossFit, but they tend to come and they already tend to be carrying some of the more common niggles that we see from people who have been doing CrossFit for a little while. So whether it's some kind of knee or hip issue or some kind of shoulder issue, which generally these kind of things, I think CrossFitters by nature will ignore it for as long as they possibly can. And then eventually it gets to a point where they can't do the things that they want to do. And at that point, they deal with it. So I get a lot of people coming to me and they've reached that point where they know that they can't just carry on doing what they're doing anymore. They need to change something, but they also don't just want to stop completely and just focus on rehabbing an injury. And I feel like that's where being able to be across both kind of the physiotherapy and the S&C side of things fits together quite well, because generally if they go and see a physio, they'll be given very specific exercises for what they need to do, and they can be, perfectly good exercises. But it generally involves them having to rest from other things that they might be able to do, or they're unsure as to how to fit that all together. So generally when people come to me with these kind of things, obviously it depends on the nature of the injury, but the first period of time can be about just getting them back to a good baseline where pain's under control, and they can gradually start to rebuild movements that they've not been able to do, whilst at the same time being able to make the most of the things that they can do. So like I say, someone comes with patellar tendinopathy, in the short term we might stay away from squatting while we rebuild, but we can focus on a lot of gymnastic work, for example, and it's then making the most of those things, because I think injuries and injury management, a lot of it is a mental game. So I think, especially with something like, say, tendinopathy, it can take a little bit of time to get on top of, and it can be a little bit frustrating if you're someone who enjoys weightlifting and things like that. So being able to focus on the things that they can do and get some good progress there is motivating. Whereas if you were just to cut all that stuff completely, that it gets quite boring and you get quite fed up. That's something I found, like with my shoulder. So,
what do you find are some of the things? Because one of the things I find a little bit more challenging is just trying to teach athletes a little bit of a process around how to navigate and manage the injury. So whether it's rating things in terms of discomfort and pain, which I think is a simple one, feedback, telling me, okay, and also understanding that you might not feel pain on movement or discomfort on movement, but post, and that might still have happened because of the training. So what are some of the things that you start to sort of work on with athletes, and some of the, I'd say, training habits that you try to instill in them?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is like pain education. So I think understanding, and everyone looks at this from a different perspective, because for some people they're very much like, it hurts, I'm not doing it. Other people are like, it hurts, I don't care. So trying to get people to a middle ground where they know what is, I don't want to say a safe level of pain, but what is an expected level of pain, say, for the injury that they may have, and what is safe to do with that pain is quite important. Because I feel like, again, if you're looking at something like tendinopathy, you are gonna feel pain at points, whether that's before, during, or after, depending on what you're doing. But equally, if you're someone who avoids pain and we completely unload, then that tendinopathy is going to be there for a long, long time, because without strengthening, it's never going to recover. So I think that's a big thing. I think with some people, getting them to tell you when something is painful straight away, as opposed to 3 months down the line when it's become intolerable, is a big thing, because some people will kind of just carry on and try and push through, like I say, and then that can mean that the actual problem that we have to deal with is worse. Whereas sometimes if they'd have told you straight away, it might just have been a little bit of load management initially and nothing ever progresses. So that can be a challenge too. And then I think it's just talking about, again, like pain is quite a subjective thing. So, you can say to people, oh, can you rate your pain on a scale of 0 to 10? Very simple. But someone's, your 10 and my 10 might be completely different based on past experience, So again, that can be challenging, and then I think that's where using things that are a little bit more objective can help. But obviously, that's a little bit more difficult working online. Obviously, we can use like specific movements, we can use loads, we can use things like that to help, or we can use kind of more injury specific questionnaires.
Mm-hmm.
So again, if it's something like tendinopathy or patellar tendinopathy, there's like something called the Visa P, which is like a questionnaire they fill out and they can rate their symptoms using things like that, and that can help measure it too.
Yeah.
But it's a challenge because everyone has different perspectives on it.
Especially as well, because when people are training and when they're going through their training and warming up and everything like that, sometimes these things start to feel a little bit better. I forget what the word is. It's like an agilesic effect or something like that. Is it? That's the one.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I constantly reading comments. Okay, I started warming up and then it started to feel okay, and then after the session it didn't feel great. Sometimes there's loads of there's loads of variables because they obviously want to train, they're motivated to train. Especially if they're paying a good whack for remote coaching as well. There's part of it which sometimes people end up feeling like, okay, I'm losing out here. But at the end of the day, they are investing in something where it should be being adapted, it should be being changed, it should be an approach which is working with them and around the issue rather than just like them having to meet the training every single time.
Definitely, but I think that's where making the most of the remote coaching comes in, because you're getting something that's specific to you. You're not just following a generic program.
Yeah.
So why not have that conversation so that between you can work out, okay, what's the best course of action here?
Yeah. It definitely takes a bit of time in the beginning for some people, especially if they've been working on some generic program where they're just left to do their own thing and figure it out for themselves. Sometimes I have to tell people like, hey, this is what I'm here for, so let me do it. I'd actually prefer that I do it because I've seen many people go through this. Okay, so I'm going to go through my first point, and I suppose this is something that people end up actually just getting remote coaching for at the end of the day, but the biggest thing that I see that they need in comparison to what they've been doing previously in their training is just having a plan that's prioritised. And I think that obviously we need to identify the weaknesses and priorities that an individual has, and what this is going to give them is a lot more direction and intention around their training. They're going to be able to look at their training and understand why they're doing certain pieces. They will be a little bit more objective in how they carry that out. Sometimes that can have a real positive effect over the long term as well, because people end up becoming quite motivated to work on these things. And then I'd say that people can end up having their training sort of turn into just turning up. And if we look at the majority of competitive training programs, they're going to look quite similar, right? We're going to be doing a few different exercises a couple of times a week. We're going to be trying to get strong. We're going to be trying to get fit. We're going to be working a lot of gymnastics. And one of the things I notice is that sometimes when people are just going through the motions in their training, it can end up almost, although they're doing different things, it can almost end up being like a bunch of mates turning up to play five-side football. And they just go through the motions. There's no real direct work. There's no real focused work on developing this part of your game or that part of your game. It's, okay, we squat once a week, we snatch once a week, we do faster intervals once a week, we do a longer Metcon once a week, etc., etc. So I think that having priorities allows people, and it gives people permission to take their foot off the gas on some things and just understand that, hey, that's not important for you right now. And then it allows them to direct their training focus, their resources into other areas of their game. I think that when we are looking at priorities, it's important to also try to figure out if something is more of a sports priority or whether it's more of a system priority. And athletes will usually come to you with a lot of what we would consider as like a sports priority. These are the things that they feel when they're doing workouts. These are the things that affect them on the competition leaderboard. These are skills that they can't do. These are situations that they are always being challenged by and facing workouts. And it might be, okay, this person needs to learn X, Y, and Z skills, but then a system priority might be just, in general, this person struggles with endurance work, or they struggle with strength work, or it could be skills. And usually you end up having a few different buckets that you can fit people in. And I've found that what can be important is, first of all, just sort of identifying what this system-based priority would be in the first place. And then just trying to make sure that the general training always has a slant towards that. And then you're looking obviously at sports priorities, and you're looking at the things which will affect their performance more directly in a competition. When you're creating the progressions, you obviously need to be balancing things that are going to be long term. You need to be also addressing things which you can get quick wins with. And I think that's probably something which is quite useful to use in the beginning part of someone's training, is to get them some quick wins with just exposing them to things that they've not done before. If someone, say for example, I had this example, someone struggled with any sort of gymnastics pressing work, and they said that they never really did any strict bar dips, and this was just based off of I think I was just collecting some training information, like, okay, how many reps unbroken do you have of a strict pull-up, of a strict dip, strict handstand push-up? And I noticed he was like, I've never really done these. So then I was thinking to myself, well, this is great. This is an opportunity for us to get in a different form of pressing work and get a quick win, and just work on something in a little bit more of a short-term focus, which will develop a bit of confidence and a bit of momentum with this priority area. And then you obviously have competition-focused or more sport-specific focused progressions that you would work on these priority areas with as well. So it could be, okay, we've got a competition coming up in, let's say, 6 weeks' time. We have this skill which we need to sort of test out for, I'd say, a few weeks in the run-up to it. So let's do a couple of weeks of just accumulating this skill in similar scenarios, but making it quite manageable. And then as we get close to competition, we can make things a little bit more specific to prep in there. And overall, you've got to make sure that the priorities are just working well with the general training as well. So you don't want to be doing things which are really pulling you in one direction, and then you are focusing on priorities which should be pulling you in a different direction. So, you obviously have the very individual things that, okay, every Monday we are going to be working on this skill, or Tuesdays are your engine day or something like that. But you've got to make sure that all of the other training around it as well is moving in a similar direction. So I think that priorities and just getting a plan which is generally working in one direction to work on these priorities is going to be the biggest thing that people get when they start coaching.
Yeah, and obviously, like, say someone comes to you and you've identified, or they've identified where that priority is, but they don't necessarily want to spend the time on it. Then how do you approach that kind of situation?
I think that sometimes people just don't want to do certain things in their training, and I think that's completely fine. But I'm pretty upfront with them as well, and just say, well, if you want to compete at this level, then you need to be able to do X, Y, and Z. These are some of the things that I've had athletes in the past who are usually able to do, and these are the things that I've noticed in the sport. But if you don't want to do it, that's completely fine. You're just going to be at a disadvantage. So it's not really, that's something that doesn't really occur too often. People don't necessarily come out and say, I don't want to do that thing. But what I will say is that some people just demonstrate it in the way they go about their training. So it could be a training piece that they always miss on a Wednesday at the very end, because every single Wednesday they run out of training. And then I'll flip the script and I'll move that progression onto a Monday when they're usually doing all of their training, and I notice it gets skipped again. And in those situations, it usually is a bit of like an intervention. It's just saying like, hey, it's completely fine. Like I had one athlete once, and I think she was she really liked the idea of becoming a semi-finals athlete, and she was very wrapped up in this sort of identity around it. And I just noticed that there were certain things that weren't necessarily aligned with the way that she approached training, lifestyle stuff, and it just took a few conversations of being like, is this something you really want to do, or is it something which you want to be a little bit looser in terms of your objective and everything like that? Because I think some people can actually get caught up in having other people's goals as well, and the sport also develops to the point where when we went to regionals, if you trained twice a day and you were pretty deliberate and planned in how you approach that type of stuff, you had a good chance of making it. Whereas, every single year it just gets harder and harder and harder, and now you're at the stage where if people want to compete at that, let's just call it entry level, like advanced level, right? If someone wants to be in making it to a national level competition, then they end up having to put in a lot of work and have to essentially revolve their whole life around their training. So sometimes those things can get a little bit, not necessarily out of hand, but people end up just following something which they don't really want, but they probably just prefer the idea of.
Yeah, no, you're right. I think part of it as well, sometimes, depending on what it is people want or say that they want to work on but keep missing, then playing around with like the order of the sessions as well, I find helps a little bit. Because it might be that something that they keep avoiding, and in theory, you can have a very logical order to your session, but if they're not doing it, then it kind of throws it out the window. So sometimes doing things a little bit backwards, all right, it might mean the rest of the session's compromised a little bit, but if it means that they actually do the thing that they need to do the most, then it's worthwhile. I find that especially with people who feel or who struggle with like more the conditioning side of things, then if you naturally you might put that at the end of the session, but sometimes by doing that, by the time they get there, it's a little bit like the whole five-a-side thing. They just want to hang around with their mates, and their mates are doing completely different metcon that's irrelevant to them, but they jump in on that one instead, just because that's all they feel like doing by the time they get there. So just tweaking things like that sometimes can help a little bit too, I find.
Yeah, and I think there's a balance there as well with how much you are working on priority areas and how much you are just going through the general motions of training, because it is fine to have things on maintenance, and I think it's fine to also have a metcon or two during the week where there isn't necessarily a particular focus in terms of energy systems or skills or scenarios or anything like that. And in those situations, I do really encourage people to be like, go and train with other people, enjoy yourself, do what you want to do. Most of the time people end up doing like an EMOM or something very simple in that sense, but maybe that's what they need. And in the grand scheme of things, if it means that they're engaging in their training longer term, I think that's a win.
Yeah, I guess the next thing then that where I would start with people, or people tend to come with, a lot of it is around a similar kind of concept like the skill development. And I feel like that can applies to a lot of things. Obviously, I think people generally tend to think about it in terms of the gymnastic skills, but equally from like a weightlifting standpoint, then it's a big thing there too, because I think generally when people transition into like more of a bespoke coaching program, then either they've done something more generic, so there's been these movements in there, but they've not really had a progressive way to learn them, or if they can kind of do them a little bit, then they just kind of make do and muscle through, as opposed to actually working on refining the skill, because it almost becomes a little bit a case of just completing the program or completing the workout, as opposed to thinking about how they're doing it. So I think that's definitely one part of it. Or they've come from classes where obviously in a class setting, depending on where you're training, it might be that those skills just don't get touched on, because it's it might be a little bit irrelevant to the other people in the classes. But if you're one of the, because realistically people competing from CrossFit gyms, you're talking a small percentage of your entire membership base. So it might just be that because of that, the programming doesn't reflect training towards competing. So if you're someone who wants to do that, obviously the skills that you have to learn depend on the level that you want to get to, and that might be something that you've not touched on before. So I think gymnastics wise, that's definitely something that I see a lot. And then more from like a weightlifting standpoint, I think you get the people who they've got very good strength, like their underlying strength is pretty solid. I think particularly with people who've played a lot of sport in the past, or they've trained, whether it's S&C or just bodybuilding kind of training, so their strength levels are alright, but technically they've just not spent the time refining their Olympic lifting to the point where they can really make the most of that strength. Or you get the people who they kind of have neither really, but just because of training background. So it's spending the time on obviously refining the technique, but then also building that strength. And I think with both of those things, or whichever kind of way you look at it, I feel like the hard thing is, especially when you start working with someone initially, it's helping them understand like the long-term benefit of working on the things that you might be working on. Because especially if they've come from like the competitor program kind of mindset where they feel like they're coping, but it's a limiting factor. The temptation for them is always to revert back to, oh, well, I'll just get by. I'll just kind of make it through, because taking the time to really refine a skill in that moment can feel like a little bit of a step back. Whereas obviously realistically, with all of those things, when we're talking about making more consistent progress and not hitting ceilings over a period of time, the sooner we can get on top of those skills, then the quicker you're going to be able to reach a point where your progress becomes a lot more consistent, because you're no longer going to be limited by some kind of technical issue, or when it comes to competing, if there is just a skill that you can't do, you might always find that you're competing within a certain division until you've mastered that skill that then allows you to compete in the next division. And I think it was something when I was younger, when I was like 19, 20, just starting out in CrossFit, I think it's something that I struggled with myself. And I remember the first open that I did, the first workout had double unders and power snatches in it. And I just not spent the time working on my double unders because it didn't interest me. But I also remember how frustrated I was during that open workout when I couldn't string together more than 2 double unders. And in my head, like thinking in my ego, I'm thinking, I'm being beaten on this workout by people who I would normally beat quite comfortably in the classes in Metcons. But because I've not spent the time working on this skill, it's really holding me back. And I think it's changing that mindset in people sometimes. But then also within that, it's a case of looking at what skills they're lacking and then coming up with a structured way to deal with it, so that they're not thinking every session is just working on technique. It's a case of finding that balance where sometimes they can just go and just enjoy it, and other times we can work on refining things, working on technical aspects, so that they're making progress at the same time.
All right, so I'm going to go over my second point. We have a little bit of some connection issues, so we're not necessarily able to get a bit of a dialogue here. However, we will still be able to hit all our points. So for me, on the second point, the second biggest thing I say that people end up needing to work on is just basic strength and endurance development. And I see that individuals will come in and they might have a good breadth of training. They might have done a good sort of broad amount of different styles of work, whether it's jumping into classes or whether it's been on a competitor's program, but they probably just haven't spent enough time really digging deep and going through, call it 2-3 months of strength development work or engine building. And that's probably something which I think a lot of people underestimate how long that type of stuff actually takes. Like I said before, it's sort of the breadth of training you generally get within CrossFit means that people will have a good amount of exposure to everything, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they've got the training volume under their belt. And I find that when people end up getting that training volume under their belt, it just starts to tie together a lot of things, and it just makes their general training a lot better. And people call this sort of base building, and I would say it's the intermediate phase for an athlete. It's once they've gone in, they've got a real good taste for the sport, they've started to develop some basic competency with the majority of the skills. Maybe they'll have a couple of competitive experiences under their belt. And then what they need from there is to actually just start to get to work on the things that they need to work on, their priority areas. And most of the time, that's just basic strength development and endurance development. And that type of stuff and that type of training, it takes a while for people to develop. And you might have someone who, they might come in from a sporting background and maybe they have a little bit more of a slant towards endurance development. They've done a fair bit of running in their time, or maybe they played some field sports which required them to be fairly fit. And sometimes in those situations, that person just needs to go through a couple of years of maybe training with a little bit more of a strength bias, obviously doing everything, nothing ever should leave the program, but it's going to be a little bit more of a longer term look at their development. And the conversation usually is, okay, well, if your goals are to be competing at this level, we've got to be hitting these numbers, and it's not just a case of a 6-week bump in your squat strength that's going to affect this. It's going to be a case of you going through that for a good amount of time. And it doesn't mean that you're just working continuously on strength all the way straight through. It means that you're going through phases where you are focusing on strength, and then you're taking it back a little bit, you're taking your foot off the gas, and then you're going back into it. And you're just, the overall general direction is going towards strength development or endurance development. Sometimes it can happen with skills as well, but usually with skill development, these things can be a little bit quicker in terms of how quickly you can get a little bit of momentum going with it. But definitely for strength work and endurance work, the work needs to be done, the minutes need to be spent on the rowing machine, and the reps need to be done on your squats and your deads and all of that type of stuff. And I would say that it can be a little bit boring for people when they first start to get into it, but when people end up getting a little bit of momentum with it and they start to see it positively affecting their CrossFit performance, that can be really good. And for me personally, I've always had a little bit more of a bias towards strength work and weightlifting. And I think when I started working with a coach and we worked more on just general endurance development, it was probably for about 6 months of doing that type of work that I started to really feel it in my CrossFit performance. And I do remember, I think it was just we were working generally on more endurance focused stuff, but I just started to notice how it had a positive effect on quicker workouts. And I think I did a competition one time, and there was 2 workouts that were sub 10 minutes, and I was doing very well on them, and I wasn't expecting to do as good on it because I hadn't really worked in that time domain. But I just spent a long time doing a lot of rowing intervals, doing a lot of, I would say, conditioning work, which was just a little bit easier. So like an RPE-A, just focusing on sustainable work, like a sustainable output. And I found that just had a real positive effect on a number of different areas. And after that, I was like sold, and it didn't necessarily have the say. I didn't find it as boring because I knew it was working. And but that's my second point is development of basic strength and endurance work and doing that base building.
Yeah. So my final thing, I guess, there's a couple, but I think the one probably worth talking about is when you see, again, people coming in from different backgrounds. And I think one pattern that you do tend to notice is, I think, particularly in females, is they don't tend to necessarily have a huge amount of upper body strength, whether that's because of, the difference in perhaps sports that males and females might play growing up, or just the different kinds of training. Obviously, I think guys generally might have spent more time doing bodybuilding type things. So they generally come in and they don't necessarily have that kind of underlying upper body strength that's going to help them when it comes to other elements of developing. Because I think obviously without that, kind of linking back to what we talked about earlier with like skill development, if they don't have the upper body strength, then there's going to be areas that they're struggling with there. But then equally, I find if they've not got that underlying strength, sometimes just tolerating the general volume of doing more specific gymnastic programming as opposed to just doing a little bit at the start of a class, then that can take some getting used to for them. So you can't necessarily do the same amount of kind of quality work because they don't have that underlying strength. And when you think, and obviously that's something that you can apply to both gymnastics, but then also even like to your Olympic weightlifting. Again, that can be an area that I find females can struggle with a little bit more if they don't have that strength. But then I think the challenge is then finding a balance between how we work on that and fitting that into a training program. Because I think obviously it might be a little bit different to what they've done before, but when your training time is limited, obviously you can't just suddenly add in loads of upper body strength work. So it's looking at, okay, let's just say we're focusing it towards, they're working on some, say skill development with something on the rig, is how can we use some of the strict strength work that we might do to assist that as their strength work, as well as working towards their skill development with other kind of drills or movement patterns that are going to help build strength in a similar way. And I think as well with some people there's probably a little bit of reluctance to do it because they don't necessarily see it as CrossFit. It's not what they're anticipating and it's not something they've done before. So it's putting across to them the benefit of doing it and how it's going to help them like later on. But I think also as well, even within that, I think, as we've said before, I think bodybuilding and general strength training has a big effect on other elements of CrossFit too. And it's helping them understand that so that they kind of buy into it. And then that helps with implementation of it.
Yeah, I think the general training effect of just doing that type of work and working on upper body strength and strict gymnastics and those things, I think is really underrated. And I think one of the biggest things that I find it can help people with is it just allows them to practice their gymnastics more often, because hanging from the bar isn't as fatiguing when you've got a good amount of strict pull-ups under your belt. But if you've got only 1 to 3 reps, every time you jump up and you start hanging from the bar and doing a bunch of kipping work, it's tiring. It takes it out of you. So just having that general capacity allows you to practice the sport more and then get more out of your skill work, because it's not a case of, oh, my grip is about to blow up and I'm not able to hang on to the bar, so therefore this changes how I try to move through space. Whereas someone who actually has a better connection to the bar, stronger grip, they're able to pick up on the nuances of the movement a little bit more and get a lot more out of their skill development. For my third one, this is something which I think is probably, when people are looking for coaching, is probably the thing that...
Hey everyone, Matt Harvey here. I produced this podcast that you're listening to or watching just now, so if you like the way that it looks and sounds, that's partially down to me. If you've got a podcast, video, or other online project that you'd like some production help with, or even if you just want to chat through some ideas, drop me a DM or an email. My details can be found in the show notes below. Thanks so much for your time. On with the show.
They don't necessarily anticipate as much, but it can have the biggest impact. And that is just intention and coaching and a little bit of feedback on how people do conditioning. I think a lot of people understand the importance of having an individualized training program. They know they're probably going to get some feedback on their skill work and on their lifting. But if we think about CrossFit as a sport, getting feedback on your conditioning, getting feedback on your metcons is like having a coach on the side of the pitch watching a football match and getting some feedback, or having at least someone help you create a bit of a game plan as you're going about it. And I think that a lot of people, they just think about doing CrossFit as playing the sport, and the training that goes on around that is just trying to sort of develop their raw physical capacities so that they're able to play the sport better. And there is definitely a element of that going on within the training, and we're trying to make sure that people are fundamentally getting fitter and stronger and more skillful, so they're able to put it into practice in a 12-minute Metcon. But sometimes you actually just need to have a little bit of directed focus and a little bit of feedback on pacing. And it can go a very long way. Being what you can say is sort of just more gifted in CrossFit can go pretty far. I'm a perfect example of someone who just did not necessarily have the raw capacity, the raw strength that other athletes had, but I was able to be competitive up to obviously a certain point, just because I had skills and I sort of knew how to pace. And there was a point I did not know how to pace, but I was able to sort of do this thing where you bounce from movement to movement pretty well and keep myself busy and give myself little goals within things and not necessarily blow up as much on certain movements. And it would be to the point where there were people who I would train with who were fitter than I was, they were stronger than I was, but I was able to do better in CrossFit workouts. And part of that was just having a bit of nous within the sport. And I think that what you can develop that obviously when you are just practicing it and you're getting training under your belt and you're doing lots of metcons and you're doing a lot of practice. But there does come a point, especially in the way that the sport is developed now, where you just might need someone to say, hey, I want you to stay close to the barbell as you're going through those drop and go reps. Just avoid taking that step back, putting your hands on the knees, try to lift on a clock. Just have a clock in front of you every 10 seconds, try to do a clean. Or let's think about a big one is going to be someone's able to do 20 to 30 unbroken chest to bar pull-ups. Okay, do not do anything over 5 reps in this workout. Just maintain that. And if we look at some of the performances that I think a typical one for me is they repeated it not long ago, but it was 14.4, I think. It was the workout that started off with, I think it was like a 60 calorie row, into 50 toes to bar, into 40 wall balls, and then I think there were 30 power cleans at 135.95, and people were able to do touch and go reps with 135.95. But if we look at the CrossFit Games athletes who go through that, they're all just doing singles. And I saw a lot of people go through that workout back in 2014 and then also back a couple of years ago when it got repeated, where they're trying to do touch and go reps, and it's like, why are you doing that? This is not where the bottleneck is on the workout. And I think that some people just need to be told, hey, don't do that. That's stupid. That's silly. Let's change that up. And you might need a couple of little tidbits of information that you get, a coach gives you. Sometimes these are also just tacit skills that you pick up and you develop from training around other people. And I think that that's probably where the benefit is when people say, oh yeah, training environment is everything. It's about pushing each other and all this type of stuff. And I don't think it is. I think it's literally just seeing people do better than you, trying to copy them and trying to, emulate the good things that you see in other people's performances, and just, it's sort of picking up different skills and different strategies from other people. The feedback that I give people is mainly on their pacing, and then it's going to be giving them, education around, okay, this is a cyclical movement, therefore you should not stop. If you get in someone's feedback, I broke up the burpees in sets of 10. It's like, what are you doing? You should even be trying to think about your burpees in sets of 10. You should just be doing a one consistent pace throughout. Or it could be something along the lines of giving someone some very specific reps you need to follow for their gymnastics. Or it can just be on sort of more heavier barbell work. It can just be a cadence that they're trying to follow when it's going to be that battery style, heavy repeated efforts. And then in addition to that, it's finding workouts and creating workouts where they are forced to actually practice those skills. So it's not just a conditioning piece. It's not just a metcon that you do at the end, but there is a very specific purpose behind it. And it could be something along the lines of, a typical one that I use is I will give people an AMRAP to do, and I will break the reps down more than you would typically see when you're going through a CrossFit workout that you would see in the open or in a competition or on .com. So let's say the workout, I think it was actually a CrossFit.com workout the other week, and it was 5 rounds for time, and I believe it was like 5 chest to bar, 5 wall ball, heavier wall ball weight, and 5 box jump step down. So it was 12, 12, 12 for 5 rounds. And if someone has difficulty pacing a workout like that, it could be just about chopping it down and saying, okay, do 10 rounds for time of 6, 6, and 6. Or it could be 15 rounds for time of 4, 4, and 4. And then in that situation, you're giving them a workout you're probably not going to see in a competition, but you're constraining it in a way which keeps them moving, and it forces them to adopt a certain pacing method. And I've found that's particularly effective, and it's something that I picked up from a coach that I was working with. And I remember asking the same questions, like, why am I doing push press with 35 kilos for 5 reps at a time? This is definitely something I'm not going to see in a workout. And he just said, hey, I just want to see you keep moving for the whole 10 minutes without stopping. I was like, all right, okay, makes sense. And it's a really effective tool just to get people to work on their pacing. And then as well as that, you can obviously create all the fancy progressions and conditioning schemes and everything that's going to help them for their conditioning and for their pacing. But you also need to strategically give them those workouts which are going to be learning moments and might kick them in the ass a little bit, because those things do happen in a sport. You don't obviously want to do that too much, but you obviously need to just say to someone at some stages as well, where you may be only a few weeks away from the open or a competition, and you're just going to say, I know we've been working on like a really rigid rep schemes on your chest to bar in these workouts, and you've been working in a position where you're working within a very manageable intensity, but we need to flip it a little bit, and you actually need to just get a bit exposed and just try and figure it out in the chaos. And that's also part of the process. It's not just about creating workouts which they can do with ease all the time. Sometimes it is just the analogy I would use is you're holding them over the ledge of a cliff, and you're telling them, don't worry, it's okay. I don't know if that's a good analogy or not, but it's giving people those sort of moments where it might be a little bit scary for them, but you're doing it in a way where they feel that they're going to be supported, and it's part of a bigger picture process. And then when they do end up going into competition, if they do have a situation which throws a challenge at them, okay, they're able to handle it. And I think that that's just as big a part of making their conditioning more manageable. All right, we're going to wrap that up there. I know that the connection issues didn't really allow that to be much of a dialogue, but hopefully you got some bigger picture ideas of some of the things that happens early in the coaching process, but then also some things which are going to be a little bit more specific and tactical. So make sure you do the podcast thing. So give us 5 stars on Spotify, Apple, all that business. Make sure you subscribe on YouTube. And we'll be probably doing a few more question and answers in the next couple of episodes. So if you see those pop up on Instagram, make sure you get your questions across.